Hello everyone, welcome to the show. My name's Merlin Fulcher. It's Wednesday the 1st of July. It's almost 4 months since the beginning of the lockdown, and there's actually been so you could say some positive news, which is that according to the Office for National Statistics, effectively the number of excess deaths recorded in England and Wales is now back to normal levels. And effectively what that means is that the kind of extraordinarily horrible impact of the virus seems to have melted back into what is normally the extraordinary kind of horrible impact of industrial society on people's health and well-being. So you could say that's an achievement, but effectively we're back. We're kind of back where we started. Although of course things will never be the same again. And what's really crucial, I've been thinking more and more about this, is the issue of housing. Because housing is a kind of infrastructure, but it's very rarely recognised as an infrastructure. But as we move into this new sort of post-pandemic era, the deficit of housing, the kind of shortage of housing, and the fact that so many of us live in inadequate and overcrowded housing is more and more will be realised as the single greatest thing that unites all parts of this country. And I think that's no greater and more obvious than it is in the case of what we're now describing as local lockdowns. So this week, one of the big images is this. It's a map of Leicester, and this has been on the news, been in the newspapers, and effectively what this shows is a red line. And this is a red line where if you're inside that red line, you theoretically are living under much stronger lockdown restrictions. So for example, on Saturday this weekend, pubs are going to reopen in London. They will not be reopening in the centre of Leicester. In fact, non-essential shops are being advised to close, and within a few days the police are going to have new powers which will allow them to kind of enforce this harsher restriction. And so this is, I'm sharing this image, it's a sort of geographic concept. It doesn't really tell you much about Leicester, but one of the things we know about Leicester is that it's quite a densely populated city, but not just densely populated, but the fact is that a lot of people are living in quite inadequate housing. It's not unusual for some parts of the city for there to be families of more than 3 people living in 3-bedroom houses, for example. And this is to do with an infrastructural deficit of housing. It's as simple as that. We just need good, modern, affordable housing in all the parts of the country where people need it, and we don't have it. It's a technical problem which needs a technical solution. But because of this problem, Leicester is being held back. And we know that a lockdown has been massively disruptive for our economy. It's been massively expensive as a nation. And what it means effectively is that if London, where I'm lucky enough to live, we move through the lockdown and we're about to have a revival, and hopefully that will mean some jobs are reinstated and things aren't as bad. But in Leicester, if the lockdown goes on for longer in Leicester, Leicester will have a worse economic impact. Businesses in Leicester will find it harder to recover than businesses in London. It's not exactly like it's easy to recover in London, but it's going to be even harder to recover in Leicester. Now, what's really interesting, and this is a graph from it's a table from an article on the Sky News website, and this shows other places, and effectively they headed this up saying that this was a table showing where the next local lockdowns could happen. That headline's been changed this evening, so obviously they might have had some pushback on that. But what this table shows you is this is almost like it's a pretty gruesome league table. It basically says where the highest rates of coronavirus are in England. And so what you have, it says Leicester, number 1. So obviously that's why it's in the news. That's where the local lockdown is. The total cases there right now per 100,000 people is 875. And per 100,000 people, there's about 140 new cases every week. And that's an awful lot. I mean, that is every week, 140 people per 100,000 catching the virus. And, so for example, I live in Wandsworth. There's a population of about 330,000. So if you put that onto Wandsworth, that would be about 450 people getting the virus every week. That's an awful lot of people. So it's a terrible situation in Leicester. But look at this chart. Leicester's followed by Bradford. It's followed by Barnsley, Rochdale, Bedford, Oldham, Rotherham, Tameside, Blackburn and Darwen to Kirklees. These are some of the most struggling parts of the country anyway, right? And if you look through the chart, it's a really interesting chart, and you can scroll through it. Peterborough, Luton, Hull, And then if you go towards the other end, so I'm just going to speed up towards, say, page 14 or something. We've got Kingston in London, Richmond. These are quite wealthy places where only one person per 100,000 per week is catching the virus. And on the final page, West Berkshire, City of London. There's only a few thousand people and they all live in the Barbican. Apparently, no people are getting the virus every week there. City of London, the virus. There's no new cases of the virus officially. Gloucestershire, Wokingham. These are quite wealthy parts of the country, really. So what we're seeing is a massive divide, right? We're also seeing this massive divide is linked to housing problems, right? And that you're seeing the fact that because there are different housing provisions in different parts of the country, different places are having more of an impact with the result of the virus. And as a result of that, local lockdowns, which will harm their economies even more, which will hold them back and stop them from recovering even further. So far from the kind of the government's levelling up agenda, we actually have a situation where this horrific virus is actually exacerbating the differences between all of these places within England, certainly. And I think this is interesting because obviously this week one of the big stories has been Boris Johnson making his big, what's been described as a build speech. And it's effectively had been trailed as a kind of New Deal, a bit like Roosevelt's New Deal during the Great Depression in America. But that kind of all of that language was actually absent on the actual day of the speech being delivered. They kind of backtracked away from it, and anybody who listened to the speech was pretty disappointed. About 5 billion worth of money was announced in this speech, and here's a slide from the speech. You can see here's Boris Johnson. This is one of the other big images of the week. The Prime Minister with his slogan "Build, Build, Build." There's some very clean-looking high-vis vests and helmets next to him. It's pretty it's pretty cringy kind of image of him. Obviously he's wearing his suit, but he wants to sort of give this image that he's about to put on a hard hat and do some construction work and get the country building. And obviously we had stuff like this in the past. We had like the George Osborne's "We Are the Builders" speech. This whole strong association with construction and infrastructure and all this kind of stuff. None of this is new. And what's really, really interesting about Boris Johnson's speech is that he pledged about 5 billion, and the 5 billion would go towards things like roads building, a little bit towards school building, a little bit towards health, hospital building. And then he talked up a whole load of stuff about planning reform, this idea that he would take away planning controls and that would make it easier to build housing. But crucially, he said absolutely nothing about new money for housing. In fact, he basically kind of reiterated the existence of a £12 billion affordable housing pot, which was announced by previous governments. Like that 12 billion had been in the programme. It wasn't new. And he emphasised that this pot would be spent across 5 years, and it's already had 3 years, so that means it's like an 8-year pot. Which is totally not good, because it's basically you've got this money, you could intensify that money and reduce the time frame and say we're going to spend big during this downturn. But Boris Johnson is he's effectively done nothing when it comes to housing, other than saying that he's going to reduce planning controls. And now that's really, really interesting. I'm going to show you this graph. This graph shows you the delivery of housing since the financial crash. So there's 2008 on the far left, where house building after the crash went down to sort of just above 100,000 units a year, to 2019, just before the coronavirus crisis, where house building had recovered to about 250,000. And 250,000 is still below the new homes target, which is 300,000. So if we were to build 300,000 homes every year, we would actually have the right number of homes for our growing population, so that everybody could live in happy, healthy conditions where things like coronavirus local lockdowns obviously wouldn't be necessary, right? If we'd actually built 300,000 homes a year over the last 10, 12 years outlined in this graph, we would not be facing the kind of challenges we are right now. And that's a really, really important thing to remember. And it would also be something that would actually create a level playing field across the entire country, which obviously doesn't exist right now. So What effectively happened after the last financial crash was, as you can see, housing delivery went down. And what happened after the last financial crash? We had also had an austerity government which immediately cut all of the funding to deliver more affordable homes. This was something that I, as an architectural journalist, was covering back in 2010. As you can see, was the low point of this graph, 2010. And what happened after that was that they deregulated planning controls, or they attempted to reform the planning system. There was basically some tweaks. There were possibly some positive outcomes from it, but nothing revolutionary. And as you can see, there was a bit of an uptick, which actually coincides with the Olympics, the run up to the Olympics, and then it went back down. And basically, tinkering around with planning does nothing for housing delivery. It's been done before, and it basically kind of inspires a bit of confidence. It helps the share price possibly of some house builders. It doesn't really solve the problem. And what you can see from this graph is after 2014, 2015, there is an uptick. And what happened around about then is the government basically just started putting money back into the delivery of affordable housing. There's no way you can increase housing delivery without putting money into affordable housing. That's a fact. That's a simple fact. And so that when Boris Johnson, as he did in his speech this week, announced no new money for affordable housing delivery but planning controls, you can effectively expect that it will not result in more housing being built. And in fact, we've already had that this week. Savills, who are a sales agent and also a major sort of consultant on property markets generally, they're estimating that the rate of housing will drop from 255,000 new units a year being built to 171,000 new units a year being built. That's effectively like a 90,000 drop in the number of units being built. So what we can expect is this graph to have a massive drop again in the number of new homes being built. And what does that mean? That means that all of those kind of structural inequalities, those massive imbalances across the country, will be exacerbated. Places like Leicester, which are struggling with this horrible disease far more than other places, will continue to face the same obstacles because they do not have the kind of housing that Leicester needs, right? So effectively, Boris Johnson in his speech this week has really confirmed the worst possible response to this crisis you could possibly imagine. I'm an optimist, and I think that this will become very apparent, and a lot of people will be making the same point I am making in the days and weeks to come. And I hope that there will be another speech made very quickly with a very ambitious housing programme. I suspect that Boris Johnson is keeping his powder dry because he thinks that more money will be needed to bail out people through either universal credit or extended furlough schemes as the scale of mass redundancies mounts. And I think they need to use the money, arguably, for that kind of remedial work, just to really ensure that there isn't massive social unrest, effectively. However, when it comes to actually rebuilding, which is basically what Boris said he was doing, build, rebuild, housing is the only way to do that. It is the most important way to do that, and it is the biggest structural deficit that unites every part of the country. Watch this space. I think we're going to be discussing this one a lot more as we go on. Thanks for listening. Good night.